I always thought the final act of a life would come with clarity like closure, or at least fairness. But when my parents' will was read, I realized life doesn't tie itself up in neat little bows. Nathan, my older brother, received everything: the family estate in Napa Valley, the vineyard, the antiques, even Dad's prized library. I was left with a decaying house in a place I'd never heard of: Red Bluff, Wyoming. No explanation, no goodbye letter, just a line in the will to Ariana. The Red Bluff property and its contents. I remember staring at the document, numb. Nathan patted my shoulder with that same polished sympathy he'd perfected since childhood. "I'm sure it meant something to them," he said. Of course he'd say that he always got the best of everything. I got silence. When I came home and told my husband, Daniel, I thought he'd comfort me. Instead, he asked why I didn't speak up, why I always let people walk over me. I didn't have an answer. By morning, he had packed a suitcase and left. "Figure out who you are," he told me before closing the door, "then maybe we'll talk." So I drove to Wyoming, alone. I expected to find a rotting roof and broken walls. I didn't expect to find history breathing beneath the dust. I didn't expect to find her, or myself. What began as a betrayal became the beginning of everything. They used to call me the gentle one. Sometimes I think that was just a nice way of saying forgettable. Growing up in the Westfield household was like living under a spotlight you could never reach. Nathan, 4 years older, was born for it. He was tall, eloquent, athletic, the kind of kid who won spelling bees and state tennis tournaments in the same week. My parents, Catherine and Douglas Westfield, never missed one of his events. The mantel over our stone fireplace was filled with his trophies, framed newspaper clippings, even a photo of him shaking hands with the governor at some fundraiser in high school. Me, I was the background, quiet, creative, obedient, the child who colored inside the lines and didn't ask for much. Mom used to say, "Ariana, you're our calm after the storm." I once thought that was beautiful. Now I realize it meant I didn't disturb the waters. I didn't demand. I didn't compete. I played piano at school recitals, stitched my own Halloween costumes, and brought home A's with a hopeful smile. But the spotlight never shifted. Not really. I learned to find joy in small spaces, the corners of the attic where dust made the light look like magic. The feel of charcoal between my fingers when I sketched. The sound of rain against the window while I curled up with a book. I found wonder where no one looked. But wonder doesn't earn applause in a family like mine. Visibility does. Nathan and I were not rivals that would have required parity. No. We were opposites in every sense. He was the heir. I was the extra. He was bold. I was careful. He laughed easily, made deals at family gatherings, flirted with girls and future investors. I watched from the staircase, half invisible, waiting to be noticed. But it wasn't cruelty, not in the traditional sense. My parents never screamed or cursed or raised hands. Their neglect came wrapped in politeness, in indifference masked as trust. "We don't worry about you, Ari." Mom would say, "You're so self-sufficient." But I wasn't self-sufficient. I just knew no one was coming to help. By the time I turned 21, Nathan had already taken over the management of the vineyard. Dad handed him the keys like he was passing on a crown. "Your brother's a natural," he told me one evening as we stood in the kitchen. I was home for the summer from design school, excited to show them my portfolio. Instead, I ended up pouring wine while Nathan gave a speech on expansion and vertical integration. I still remember the way Dad didn't even look up as he said, "You'll always have a place here, too. Maybe you could help with the branding or interior touches someday. You're artistic, after all." That word artistic was how they justified the gap between us. Nathan had vision, I had taste. He was a builder, I was a decorator. The idea that I could lead anything that I could inherit, own, command was never spoken aloud. I don't think it ever even occurred to them. So I built my own life. Elsewhere. I moved to Portland, started my own interior design business. I wasn't wildly successful, but I was proud of it. I worked hard. I created beautiful spaces for people. I turned chaos into comfort. But no matter how many projects I completed or homes I transformed, my parents never flew out to see my work. They sent Christmas cards, gift baskets, short phone calls on birthdays, but not presents, not attention. Nathan, meanwhile, had their legacy, their time, and their love bundled into a monogrammed envelope with a vineyard seal. When I met Daniel, I thought things would change. He was charming and grounded. A high school teacher who admired my ambition and said he loved how I saw things others missed. He made me feel visible, whole, like I mattered beyond what I could produce for others. We got married in a small ceremony on the Oregon coast. My parents sent regrets and a check. Still, I held on to hope. I kept visiting the vineyard for holidays, bringing wine I knew would be judged, wearing outfits I picked too carefully. Every time I told myself, maybe this time they'll see me, really see me. They never did. So when the lawyer unrolled the will, and Nathan received everything, the vineyard, the house, the land, even the heirloom grandfather clock, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just folded my hands in my lap and waited for the next line. And then it came to Ariana Westfield, the lawyer said, clearing his throat. We leave the property known as Red Bluff House, located in Carbon County, Wyoming, along with all contents therein. Silence. I had never heard of Red Bluff in my life. Nathan leaned toward me, half whispering with a smirk. Maybe they thought you needed a fixer-upper. Then he laughed and clapped me on the back like a frat boy. I smiled, but something inside me cracked. Later that night, I stared at the scanned deed on my laptop while Daniel raged. They gave Nathan everything and you just sat there, he asked, pacing our living room. You didn't even ask why. I didn't. Because I already knew the answer. I wasn't part of the dynasty. I was the quiet one, the forgettable one, the one who wouldn't make a scene. I don't want to fight over a vineyard, I said softly. Daniel stopped walking. It's not about the vineyard, Ariana. It's about what you never do. You never fight for yourself. The next morning, he was gone. That's how I ended up alone, behind the wheel of a rented SUV, driving through Wyoming with a file folder on the passenger seat and my wedding ring tossed into the glove box. I didn't know what I expected to find in Red Bluff. An abandoned cabin, a broken window, and a family of raccoons, I wasn't sure. All I knew was that, for once, I needed to walk toward the story, whatever it was, instead of always standing quietly at its edge. The first thing I noticed about Red Bluff wasn't the town. It was the silence. There were no car horns, no shrieking sirens, no city buzz humming under the surface. Just open sky, rustling grass, and the distant whistle of wind sweeping through brittle fence lines. As I turned off the highway, the road narrowed into gravel, then dirt. My GPS blinked once, then surrendered. I wasn't lost, just untracked. I rolled down the window. The air was cool, even in spring, crisp with pine and dust. I didn't know what I expected the house to look like, but when I saw it partially sunken into the earth, with sagging shutters and ivy strangling the porch beams, I stopped the car and just stared. It was smaller than I'd imagined. A simple wooden structure with a steep, gabled roof, a wraparound porch barely hanging on, and a chimney that leaned like it wanted to fall but didn't dare. The paint, once white, had faded into something between bone and ash. Nature had started reclaiming it, vines along the siding, moss curling at the base. Still, it stood.
I parked and stepped out. The ground crunched under my boots. In the stillness, even my footsteps sounded like an intrusion. I approached the porch slowly, running my fingers along the railing. The wood flaked like paper. On the front door, an old brass keyhole glinted in the light. I pulled out the ring of keys the lawyer had given me and tried the first one. It didn't fit. Neither did the second. The third clicked.
The door creaked open with a groan that made my spine stiffen. I stepped inside, bracing myself for rot and ruin. And yes, there was plenty of both the smell of mold, dust thick enough to choke on, broken glass across the hardwood floor like scattered ice, but also something else, a stillness that wasn't abandonment. It felt more like waiting. The entryway led to a small sitting room, where the light filtered through grime-streaked windows in pale golden beams. An ancient armchair sagged beside a cold stone fireplace. Shelves lined the wall, bare but for a single ceramic mug with a chipped rim. There were no family photos, no clocks, no signs of recent life. But there were details, intentions. I walked through the room slowly, noting things that didn't belong to the stereotype of old forgotten house. There was a stack of folded wool blankets in a linen closet, still neatly placed. A basket in the kitchen with a cracked eggshell inside, as if someone had cooked and left without washing up. And on the bedroom dresser, a tarnished brooch in the shape of a sunburst. Not valuable looking, but meaningful. I paused in the hallway and ran my fingers over the wallpaper, faded yellow with tiny wildflowers. It reminded me of something, though I couldn't place what. A smell, a story, a song. At the far end of the hallway was a door, closed, unlike the others. I turned the knob, locked. I jiggled the other keys, but none fit. I pressed my ear to it. Nothing. As the afternoon sun slipped lower, the house darkened in patches. I opened windows and swept the floor, trying to feel less like an intruder. I found the breaker box in the back and, miraculously, got some lights on. One bulb flickered weakly in the kitchen overhead, casting a watery yellow glow. Then I spotted something odd, a narrow panel behind the pantry shelves that looked like it had been removed and reattached several times. I tugged at the shelf and heard a soft click. The wall gave slightly. I pried it open, revealing a shallow hidden compartment, no larger than a suitcase. Inside was a rolled-up piece of parchment and a small photo album tied with a faded red ribbon. I sat down on the dusty floor and untied the ribbon. The first photo made me freeze. It was of a young woman with high cheekbones and dark braids, standing in front of the very same house. She wore a dress woven with tribal patterns, definitely not the styles my mother or grandmother wore. Her eyes stared directly into the camera, unsmiling but strong. Fierce. I flipped through the pages. More black and white photos, some with children, some showing gatherings in open fields, people dancing, sitting in circles, drumming. Many of them wore traditional clothing, beadwork and feathers, symbols I didn't recognize. The last photo was in color, taken decades later. An older woman stood on the porch of the house. Her hair had grayed, but her eyes were the same. She wore a woven shawl and held a book to her chest. The caption in faded ink beneath the photo read, "Grandmother Lenora, Red Bluff, 1962. I had never heard the name Lenora in our family, not once. I opened the parchment. It was a letter, written in careful cursive, addressed to the one who returns. It read, "If you are reading this, then the house has called you. I don't know who you are, but I know you carry my blood. This house is not what it seems. Neither is our family story. The truth is buried but not lost. Follow the symbols. Trust the land. Remember who you are." There was no signature. Just a hand-drawn symbol at the bottom, a circle with a feather running through it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fireplace with the photo album on my lap and the letter resting against my chest. I made tea with the dusty kettle I found in the cabinet, letting the steam warm my face as I tried to process what I'd found. Someone in my family, likely my grandmother's mother. Or maybe her grandmother had lived here, had kept secrets, had tried to leave breadcrumbs, but why was I never told? Why had my parents, who curated every piece of family image, erased her, and why did they leave this house to me the next morning? I drove into town. Red Bluff was small, barely a town at all, more like a cluster of buildings caught between then and now. There was a diner, a hardware store, a church, and a library. I parked outside the diner and walked in, hoping for coffee and maybe answers. A woman in her 70s looked up from behind the counter. Her silver hair was braided, and her eyes were sharper than her age implied. "You're new," she said simply. "I'm Ariana," I replied. "I just inherited the old Westfield house." She paused, then wiped her hands on her apron and extended one. "Maisie Blackfeather," she said, "that house doesn't forget people, and it doesn't call just anyone." I blinked. "You know it." Her eyes crinkled. I knew her. I didn't have to ask who she meant. Maisie Blackfeather didn't waste words. She poured my coffee into a thick ceramic mug and nodded toward a booth near the window. "Sit," she said, sliding in across from me. Her hands moved with the grace of someone who'd made the same motions 1,000 times: the pour, the stir, the fold of the napkin. But there was a sharpness in her gaze, like she was sizing up more than my face. I sat, the letter and photo album still tucked inside my satchel. "You say you inherited the Red Bluff house?" she asked after a beat. I nodded. "Yes. My parents passed recently. They left it to me, though no one ever mentioned it. I didn't even know it existed." Maisie took a slow sip from her own mug. "Because they didn't want you to know." I blinked. "Excuse me." She set her cup down carefully. "That house belonged to Lenora Highfeather, your great-grandmother, my cousin." The words struck like a spark to dry leaves. I sat straighter, my pulse quickening. "But my mother's name was Catherine Langford. Her mother was Marion. I've never heard the name Lenora, not once." Maisie gave me a knowing look. "Your grandmother Marion was Lenora's daughter. Lenora was Shoshone. When she married your great-grandfather, a white settler from Idaho, his family insisted she cut all ties to our people. To survive, she changed her name, erased her tribal connection, and moved to Oregon. The Red Bluff house was her sanctuary. It was where she went to remember who she was." I was silent. The words felt impossible, and yet everything about the house, the symbols, the woman in the photos, the letter, it all aligned. Maisie pulled a worn leather pouch from her apron and untied it, laying out a small stone with the same circle and feather symbol I'd seen on the letter. "We mark our sacred places with this," she said softly. Lenora carved it into the baseboards, into the trees behind the house. She was a weaver, a knowledge keeper. But after she passed, the house went silent. Your family stopped visiting. I figured no one would return," I whispered. "Why me?" Maisie studied me a long time. "Blood remembers. Even if people forget." Her words landed like a tremor beneath the skin. I left the diner with my head spinning. It was like staring into a mirror I didn't know had been fogged over my whole life and finally seeing the shape of my own reflection. I wasn't just the overlooked daughter. I was the descendant of someone my family had chosen to erase. Back at the house, I started searching more deliberately. The late afternoon sun poured through the kitchen window as I ran my fingers along the old wooden floorboards, checking for grooves. It was Maisie's comment that led me to look behind the bedroom dresser. There, scratched faintly into the wood, was the symbol again, the circle and feather. Beside it, smaller, almost hidden, was another marking a line of symbols I didn't recognize, carved vertically like a story running downward. I took photos of them and sent them to Maisie's phone. hoping she'd understand. Minutes later, my phone buzzed with a reply. It's a name. Yours, in Shoshone. Tears welled before I could stop them. That night, I didn't dream of loss. I dreamt of braids woven tightly, of drumming in the dark, of a woman standing beneath the moon holding a feather aloft like a torch. I woke before sunrise, breathless. The next morning, Maisie arrived at the house with a basket of herbs and a folded bundle wrapped in deer hide. "If we're going to do this," she said, "we do it properly." She laid out smudge sticks, a bundle of sweetgrass, and a single drum that looked older than either of us. "I don't know what I'm doing." I admitted, "You don't need to," she said. "You just need to listen." She lit the sage and let the smoke curl through the air, sweeping it with a feather. As the scent filled the room, something shifted. Not in the house in me. A quiet cracking open and like a breath I'd been holding since childhood, finally released. She chanted softly in Shoshone, and though I didn't understand the words, I felt the rhythm in my bones. When the ceremony ended, we sat on the floor, backs to the wall, silent. "I want to learn," I said. "Not just about Lenora, about all of it. The stories, the songs, the language." Maisie smiled. "Then you'd better stay a while, over the next days." I did. I cleaned the house room by room, revealing more of Lenora's spirit with each layer of dust I peeled back. I found old embroidery tucked inside dresser drawers, patterns of stars and rivers. I found a rusted tin box beneath a loose plank in the kitchen floor. Inside were beads, feathers, small wooden carvings, each one more intricate than the last. Maisie returned almost daily. She taught me how to braid sweetgrass, how to recognize ceremonial markings, and how to pronounce the name carved behind the dresser Saina. She said it meant she who returns bearing light. One evening, we sat on the back porch as the sun dipped behind the mountains. "I think she left it for me," I said softly. "The house, the artifacts, the story." Maisie nodded. She hoped someone would come back, someone who still listened. I looked out at the trees swaying in the twilight wind. My family tried to bury her. Maisie's voice was gentle but firm. They buried her name, but not her blood. And for the first time, I began to understand something I had never been allowed to consider before, that I was not less because I'd been overlooked. I was powerful because I had endured, quietly, until I could finally reclaim what was mine. Not a house, a legacy. A week after Maisie and I performed the cleansing ceremony, the air in the Red Bluff house felt different. It wasn't just cleaner. It felt awake. The floor no longer creaked underfoot like it was resisting my presence. The walls, once heavy with silence, now whispered back memories, subtle ones, the brush of wind through the open windows, the soft thud of acorns on the porch roof, the occasional scent of something floral I hadn't placed yet. Sage, maybe? Or wild rose. I had begun keeping a journal, not just to track discoveries, but to trace myself. Each night I would write what I'd learned from Maisie, a word in Shoshone, a symbol, a new braid pattern. And each morning, I'd rise with the sense that I was less a visitor and more a thread being woven back into something ancient and whole. It was on one of those mornings that I found the cellar. I'd gone into the pantry to reorganize the shelves, still cluttered with rusted cans and sun-warped jars. Behind an old broom, I noticed a floorboard slightly raised. I knelt down, pried it up with a screwdriver, and revealed a small iron ring. Beneath the floor was a trapdoor nearly invisible without knowing it was there. I hesitated. The stillness in the room shifted. I pulled the ring and lifted the door. It groaned like it hadn't been opened in decades. Beneath was a narrow stairwell, steep and dark. I grabbed a flashlight, heart pounding. The air grew cooler with each step. Damp, earthy. At the bottom was a single wooden door, reinforced with metal brackets. It had no lock, only a carved handle worn smooth with time. The carvings along the doorframe took my breath away. Feathers, suns, mountains, rivers, and at the center, that same symbol I'd come to know, the circle and the feather. But this time, it was surrounded by what looked like flames. I pushed the door open. The room inside was small, more a chamber than a basement, but it pulsed with something sacred. Along the walls were shelves holding artifacts, ceremonial rattles, woven baskets, stone tools, and what looked like a folded ceremonial dress, its beadwork still vibrant in the dim light. A large drum sat in the corner, cracked but intact. In the center of the room, on a low altar, rested a single book, leather-bound and faded with time. My fingers trembled as I reached for it. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger, one that chronicled names, births, ceremonies. It was a record of a matrilineal line. Lenora's line, my line. I flipped through the pages. Each name came with a story, rituals performed, dreams recorded, visions seen. They weren't just women, they were keepers. Lenora's final entry was written in careful, slanted script. They will try to forget us, erase us from records, from memory. But we are not paper. We are stone and flame. One day, a daughter will return, not to reclaim the land, but to restore the story, to reweave what was unraveled. My eyes stung with tears. There was no mistaking her intent. She had hidden this room for someone like me, a descendant, a witness, a voice. I stayed in that room for hours, carefully photographing each page, documenting what I could without disturbing the sacred arrangement. When I emerged, the sun had begun to dip behind the tree line. Shadows stretched long across the porch. And that's when I heard the sound of tires crunching gravel. My breath caught. I peeked through the window. A black Escalade had pulled up, shiny and smug in the fading light. The driver door opened. Nathan. I hadn't spoken to him since the will reading. He looked as put together as ever, a crisp button-down shirt, perfectly styled hair, and that smile he wore like armor. In his hands, he carried a bottle of wine and a gift bag. I opened the door before he could knock. "Well," he said, raising his eyebrows, "you're hard to track down." "What are you doing here?" I asked flatly. He shrugged. As if showing up uninvited to a remote property he'd ignored his whole life was perfectly reasonable. "I heard from a little bird, maybe someone named Daniel, that you were camping out here. Thought I'd check in on my little sister. I'm not camping. I live here now." He laughed. "You're serious." I stepped aside just enough to block his view of the interior. "Why are you really here?" "Nathan." He sighed, as though this were all terribly inconvenient for him. "I'm here because people are talking. Ari, someone said you found things, objects, historical stuff, native stuff, possibly valuable." My heart sank. Of course, word had spread. And I asked, folding my arms, and he continued smoothly, "I thought maybe we could talk, as siblings, about what you found, about what to do next. I mean, you don't really have the resources to handle this. Do you appraisals, preservation, media attention? That's a lot. I know people. I could help." I stared at him. "You want a cut?" He held up both hands in mock surrender. "I want what's fair. We're family. Ari. And let's be honest, we both know Mom and Dad weren't exactly meticulous with legal clarity. I mean, technically, the property's yours, but what's inside that's ambiguous." "No, it's not," I said quietly. "It belongs to our great-grandmother, and to her people. Not to us, not to you." His expression darkened. "You're being emotional." I stepped forward, voice low and steady. No, Nathan, I'm being clear. There will be no sale, no auction, no partnership. These artifacts aren't for profit. They're part of a living culture that you chose to ignore. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. You're going to throw away a literal fortune because of some dusty trinkets and a sense of guilt, I smiled. Small and cold. No. I'm going to protect them because it's the right thing to do. He opened his mouth to argue, then paused. For the first time, I saw something behind his eyes, confusion. Like he didn't recognize me. Like the Ariana who never spoke up had been replaced. You'll regret this, he said finally. Maybe, I replied, but at least I won't regret who I am. He stared at me another moment, then turned and walked back to his car. I didn't watch him leave. I closed the door, locked it, and returned to the hidden chamber, where the stories waited, not to be sold, but to be remembered. The morning after Nathan left, I woke up feeling something unfamiliar clarity. Not the kind that comes from solving a mystery, but the kind that follows a decision, that deep breath after you finally choose your path, no matter how steep. I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the early sun melt the mist off the trees. In the distance, a hawk circled silently. I pressed my hand to the pouch where I now kept Lenora's ledger, tucked carefully inside with layers of cloth. It wasn't just a journal, it was an inheritance, and I was done treating it like a secret. That morning, I drove into town and walked straight into the library where Maisie worked part-time. I need help, I told her. She raised an eyebrow. With what? With telling the story? I said, with preserving it, teaching it, sharing it with the people who deserve to know. I want to start something. She leaned back, considering something like a museum. I shook my head. No, not glass cases and labels, not something cold and still. I want something alive, a center. A space where kids can learn Shoshone, where weavers can teach their patterns, where we can hold drum circles, storytelling nights, and ceremonies, where Lenora's voice isn't buried under dust. Maisie was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded. All right, you're not the first to dream it, but you may be the first to make it happen on that land. That afternoon, we walked the perimeter of the house together. I showed her the hidden room, the artifacts, the carved symbols on the trees out back. Her hands trembled when she touched the ceremonial dress. She sang something under her breath as her fingers traced the beadwork. A prayer, maybe. A blessing. She called together 2 elders from the nearby reservation, Thomas Redleaf, a former teacher who knew hundreds of traditional stories and songs, and Angela 2 Rivers, a midwife and herbalist who had trained generations of women. They came quietly, without ceremony, and stepped into the house as if they'd known it forever. This place remembers, Thomas said after just a few minutes. You can feel it in the walls. Angela ran her hand along the doorframe. She built this as a bridge. You're just walking across it now. I served tea. And we sat in the front room as the sun slanted through the windows. I told them everything, the discovery, the dreams, the confrontation with Nathan. They listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then Angela said, "We will help, but it must belong to the people, not to your name, not to anyone's name." I nodded. That's all I want. Over the next 2 weeks, plans began to form, not on blueprints, but on notepads and kitchen tables. I cleared out the spare bedroom to make space for language classes. Thomas offered to teach the first group of kids from the local school. Angela started preparing herbs from her garden to plant along the property, explaining which ones were used in birth ceremonies and which were used in grief. We called it the High Feather Cultural Center, in honor of Lenora. Word spread fast. Some came with enthusiasm, some with skepticism, but they came. And when they entered the house and saw what was inside the ledger, the drums, the beadwork, the altar, their eyes widened with the same awe I had felt. A retired carpenter from town named Victor James, who had grown up hearing whispers of the mystery house, volunteered to fix the porch. A group of local teenagers came to help repaint the shutters. One of the Shoshone mothers brought her daughters to clean the windows and offered to run a weekly circle for young girls, a place to talk about identity, voice, and history. It was happening, but so was something else. 3 days after we painted the new sign out front, just a wooden plaque that read, "Welcome home" in both English and Shoshone, I received a letter. It was from a firm in Jackson Hole representing a private collector. The letter was formal, respectful, and deeply unsettling. They had heard about the artifacts. They were prepared to offer $2.4 million for the entire collection, on the condition of full transfer of ownership and permanent removal from the premises. I laughed out loud when I read it. But it wasn't funny, because the envelope had no return address, and that night, I noticed a car idling near the edge of the property. The next morning, Angela found one of the elderberry shrubs she'd planted trampled and broken. A rock had been thrown through the front window. No note, just glass. I called Maisie in a panic. "This was never going to be easy," she said gently. "Some people don't want our stories told. Others want to own them. But that's why you have to keep going." I doubled the locks, asked Victor to reinforce the cellar door, moved the ledger into a fireproof safe, just in case. And I started writing everything down, not just in my journal, but in a formal archive. And still, the community came. One afternoon, during our first official gathering on the back lawn, Maisie asked me to speak. I stood under a cottonwood tree, hands shaking slightly as I looked out over 24 faces, elders, children, neighbors, strangers, people who had every right to question why a Westfield woman thought she could stand there. So I told the truth. I didn't come here to lead. I said, I came here because I was left behind, because I was forgotten by my family, by history. But this house reminded me that what's buried isn't always lost, that what's stolen can still be protected. I'm not here to take, I'm here to give back. And I hope you'll let me. Maisie stepped forward and placed a single hawk feather in my hands. "You've already begun," she said. "The ancestors are watching, and they are not ashamed." I swallowed the lump in my throat. That night, I sat on the porch again, barefoot under the stars, the feather clutched to my chest. The trees rustled gently. A distant drumbeat, real or imagined, pulsed in the air. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't alone in my skin. I wasn't Ariana the extra, the quiet one, the background blur. I was Ariana Highfeather, keeper of story, daughter of flame. The letter came wrapped in thick, cream-colored paper, as if elegance could soften the blow. It was a legal summons. Nathan Westfield, through his attorney, was suing for joint ownership of the Red Bluff property and any and all culturally significant contents discovered therein. The language was dressed up in civility, but the message was clear. He wanted the house, the artifacts, the story, all of it. For weeks, I'd known it was coming. Since that first visit, Nathan's silence had felt temporary, tactical. When I refused his offer, he didn't argue, he retreated. And now he was returning, dressed in litigation instead of conversation. I stood in the front room holding the letter, the freshly replaced window casting fractured light across the floorboards. My hand trembled. I could barely breathe. Maisie was the first to arrive. She didn't ask what was wrong. She simply read my face. "It's starting, isn't it?" she said. I nodded. "He's trying to take it all." Maisie exhaled, low and steady. "Then it's time to decide who you really are." The next few weeks blurred into a cycle of court filings, early morning phone calls, and financial panic. I couldn't afford a high-powered attorney. but Thomas introduced me to Elena Kavanaugh, a native rights lawyer who had previously fought cases involving land claims and tribal sovereignty. Elena drove up from Laramie in a dusty red truck and toured the property without a single note or question. In the cellar. She took one look at Lenora's ledger and said, "This is the backbone of your case." She sat me down that night on the porch and laid it out plainly. "The will may have been vague, but the intention is clear. Your parents left you this property and its contents. But the heart of your case won't just be legal. It will be moral. You're protecting cultural heritage, not personal gain. That story matters. A judge will hear it. But you need to speak it yourself." My throat tightened. "I've never spoken in court." Elena leaned forward. "Then it's time you learn." I spent the next month preparing. The community carried me. Rose brought food. Victor rebuilt the cellar door with metal reinforcements. The children painted signs that read, "Our stories matter," and left them anonymously in my mailbox. At night, I would sit on the porch reading Lenora's ledger aloud to myself, to the sky, to the ghost of her courage I now carried. I practiced telling my story, not just the legal version, the real one. Who I was before, who I became, and who I was choosing to be. 2 weeks before the trial, Daniel called. "I heard about the lawsuit," he said. "Is it true, yes?" I replied. "Nathan wants the land and the artifacts." He paused. "If you lose, what happens, I don't know," I admitted. Silence stretched across the line. "I didn't understand what this meant to you," he said quietly. "I thought you were just running from the family again." "I wasn't," I said. "I was running to something." He didn't reply. I didn't expect him to. Some people can't follow you into the truth. Not because they don't care, but because they're still hiding from their own. The trial took place in a small courthouse in Cheyenne, under a cloudy sky that threatened snow even in late April. Elena and I arrived early. I wore a navy dress, simple and modest, with a beaded shawl over my shoulders that Angela and the other women had made for me the week before. Across the back, stitched in fine thread, was the symbol, the circle and feather. Nathan was already seated with his lawyer, a man who looked more like a news anchor than a legal mind. They both smiled at me, polite and cold. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp glasses, entered the courtroom at precisely 9:00 a.m. She took one look at the docket, glanced at us, and said, "Let's get to the heart of this." Nathan's side went first. His lawyer framed it as a misunderstanding, that the parents' will was unclear and that Nathan, as executor of the family trust, was entitled to share ownership, especially of items that may have historical value or potential commercial worth. He used words like preservation, family unity, estate integrity. Elena rose without a binder. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "this case isn't about unclear property rights. It's about a pattern of erasure, of a culture denied its voice, and a woman, my client, finally reclaiming it." She called me to the stand. The room quieted as I approached. I looked at the judge, then at Nathan, then at Elena, and finally at the rows behind me, where Maisie, Thomas, Angela, and a dozen others had come to sit not as observers, but as witnesses. I was raised to be small. I began to avoid confrontation, to believe that heritage was something fragile, hidden in family albums and dusty attics. But when I was left this house, I discovered something more. I discovered that silence was a choice, and so is voice. I held up Lenora's ledger. My great-grandmother, a Shoshone woman named Lenora Highfeather, built this house as a sanctuary. She recorded stories, ceremonies, births, dreams not for herself, but for those who would come after her. She hid it all because she knew our family wouldn't protect it. I turned toward the judge. I didn't know I carried this blood. But I do. And once I did, I couldn't pretend otherwise. The artifacts my brother calls valuable items are not for sale. They're not antiques. They are alive. They carry spirit, meaning they belong to a people, and I am here to protect them not as Ariana Westfield, but as Ariana Highfeather, the daughter who came home. Silence. Then the judge spoke. I've read the filings. I've seen the photographs. And I've heard the testimony. She paused. This isn't just a question of legal ownership. It's a question of responsibility. She looked at Nathan. Mr. Westfield, you had your chance to steward this history. You declined. You dismissed it. Ms. Highfeather has not. The will names her as the sole inheritor of the Red Bluff property and its contents. She has demonstrated active preservation. This court sees no grounds to alter that. Case dismissed. The gavel struck wood. The room exhaled. I stood frozen. Maisie was the first to embrace me. Then Angela. Then Thomas. The courtroom faded as my knees buckled, and I let the tears fall not from fear, but from release. Nathan said nothing as he left. I didn't watch him go. That night, back at the house, the entire community gathered under the stars. We lit a bonfire in the backyard. Thomas sang an old story in Shoshone as children danced barefoot through the grass. Elder women passed bowls of food from hand to hand. Maisie draped the feather shawl over my shoulders again and whispered, She sees you. You know that now. Don't you? I nodded, my voice too thick to reply. Angela stood and raised a cup of cedar tea. To Ariana, she said. Who remembered? They echoed her name, Ariana, and for the first time in my life, I felt it not as a label, but as a belonging, not just to a family who forgot me, but to a lineage that had waited for me. Later, I stood at the edge of the clearing, looking up at the sky. The stars were endless, cold, clear. In my hand, I held the hawk feather. In my heart, I held the fire. And I knew this wasn't the end of the fight. There would always be more Nathans, more buyers, more people who wanted to own what should only be honored, but I was no longer afraid of them, because I had a name, I had a voice, and now I had chosen to use it. The weeks after the trial passed like the turning of seasons' subtle shifts, but unmistakable. And just like the land around the house, I began to bloom. The Red Bluff house was no longer a crumbling relic. It was alive with purpose. We installed new windows, reclaimed glass framed in cedar, etched with symbols from the ledger. Angela led a group of young women who hand-dyed new curtains in soft earth tones. Victor and his nephews rebuilt the deck from scratch, using local pine and old nails pulled from the barn floor. Each corner of the house felt infused with intention, like the breath of ancestors had finally returned to fill the walls. The Highfeather Cultural Center officially opened on a cool Saturday morning in late May. A banner in both English and Shoshone hung from the front porch, "Welcome home." Our stories live here. People came from everywhere, tribal elders from nearby reservations, locals from Red Bluff who had never set foot on the property, journalists curious about the trial, even school teachers looking to bring their students. I stood at the front door in the shawl Maisie gave me, a single feather woven into my braid. When I looked in the mirror before stepping out that morning, I barely recognized the woman staring back, but not because I looked different, because I looked whole. The first event was a story circle. Angela gathered the children under a cottonwood in the yard. She passed around a carved talking stick and told them, "When it's your turn, you share something, a word, a song, a memory. No one interrupts. We listen." The stick moved from child to child. Some spoke shyly. Others burst with pride. One girl named Maya, no older than 10, stood and said, "I used to be scared to say I was Shoshone. Now I tell everyone. Because of this house." She looked at me when she said it. My eyes blurred. Thomas sang that day a powerful, deep-throated chant that echoed through the trees and reached into your bones. Some people closed their eyes. Others cried. I simply sat still, hand resting on Lenora's ledger, which now lived in a protected glass case inside the house, surrounded not by velvet ropes, but by photographs of women who had come before me. We added Lenora's portrait beside the case, the same black and white photo I had found in the hidden chamber, blown up and framed. Next to it hung a new image, one of me, standing in front of the house holding the ledger, eyes steady, the symbol painted faintly behind me. Maisie refused to be photographed. I'm just the bridge, she said. You're the pillar. But she spoke at the ceremony. She told the story of Lenora Highfeather, of her sacrifice, her erasure, her legacy. She spoke of how Lenora wrote the ledger in secret, by lantern light, even after her eyesight began to fail. She spoke of the day Lenora was buried with no ceremony, not even her Shoshone name on the gravestone. And she spoke of me, of how, after generations of silence, a daughter had returned to sing again. When Maisie placed the talking stick in my hands that afternoon, I hesitated. But then I said I didn't come here to be a leader. I came here to be honest, to learn, to listen. But if this house, this land, this legacy has taught me anything, it's that the stories we carry don't belong in our pockets. They belong in the world. And I meant every word. That summer was the first time in my life I felt anchored, not by obligation, not by bloodlines I was told to follow, by truth. I hosted weekly art classes with the children. We painted patterns inspired by Lenora's beadwork and turned the old barn into a gallery space. Rose taught weaving circles in the afternoons, while Angela gave herbal medicine workshops in the back garden. The sound of laughter and music floated through the trees. The house no longer sighed with memory. It sang with movement. I began learning the Shoshone language in earnest. Maisie was patient, though often amused at my pronunciation. One day, she teased, we'll get you speaking like you were born under these stars. I smiled. Maybe I was. I just forgot the way back. In the evenings, I wrote pages and pages, not just about the past, but about the now, the children reclaiming their identity, the elders finding space to speak again, the community reshaping itself one voice at a time. I was compiling it into a book, Highfeather, the House That Remembered, a record of resistance and rebirth. But it wasn't all peace. There were still letters, anonymous offers to preserve the collection in private galleries. There were critics. Two people who said I was romanticizing a painful history or playing native for attention. Nathan never apologized. But I received another message from Daniel. It was short. I saw a photo of the opening ceremony. You looked like you'd found home. He wasn't wrong. But he was late. Because home wasn't a place. It was a truth I had walked away from everything to find. One day, a girl named Sienna asked me if she could see the secret room. I hesitated at first, but then I saw the way her eyes lit up when I told her there was a chamber beneath the kitchen with stories inside. I took her down and showed her the altar, the dress, the tools, the scrolls. She walked slowly, reverently, her small hand trailing along the wall. When she stopped in front of Lenora's ledger, she whispered, "Do you think she knew I'd be here?" My voice caught. "Yes," I said. I think she hoped. That night, I stood on the porch again. The sky painted deep indigo, the stars sharp enough to cut. I thought of Lenora, of her hands pressing symbols into the wood, of her voice hidden in ink, of her courage folded between the pages. And I knew I wasn't just her descendant. I was her answer. The seasons turned gently that year, as if even the earth had slowed to listen. By the time autumn arrived, the hills around Red Bluff were a riot of color gold. Rust, amber, and the air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. It had been nearly 6 months since the High Feather Cultural Center opened, and yet every day still felt like the beginning of something. Like I was standing at the edge of a story just starting to take root. The house breathed with life. Not the kind of noisy, surface bustle you find in cities, but something deeper. Fires crackling in the hearth, soft drums echoing from the cellar, the rustle of feet across worn floorboards as children learned steps to old dances once forbidden. I had found a rhythm, a place, a people, and myself. One morning, as I was organizing supplies for the weaving circle, I came across an old photograph I hadn't seen before. It had slipped behind the ledger cabinet. It was a faded image of Lenora, sitting on the porch in a long woven dress, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She looked content. Not smiling, not posing, just being. There was a small child beside her, a girl with dark curls and wide eyes. For a moment, I imagined it was me, not out of ego, but out of longing. A wish that I could have known her, spoken with her, asked her why she chose to write in secret instead of shouting, why she waited for someone like me instead of confronting the world herself. But I think I knew the answer now. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's a seed. I kept writing my book, every night. After the house quieted and the last car pulled away down the dirt road, I would sit by the fire with a mug of tea and add a few more pages. I wasn't rushing to finish it. I wasn't writing for acclaim. I was writing so that the next girl who felt invisible would know that stories, especially the buried ones, have power. The manuscript was almost done. One chapter remained. It would be titled, The Ones Who Came After. Maisie grew weaker as winter approached. She still visited, but now she let others lead the ceremonies, letting the younger women take her place in the center of the circle. When I walked her back to her truck one evening after a drum class, she stopped and turned to me. "You know," she said softly, "when Lenora died, I thought the story died too. I thought we had lost it forever." She reached up and touched the feather woven into my braid. "But you brought it back. Not because you were brave, but because you listened. You didn't try to own it. You let it carry you." I squeezed her hand. "You're the one who helped me listen." Maisie smiled. "Even a drum needs skin to speak. But someone still has to play it." As snow began to dust the fields and rooftops, we held a final gathering before winter. It wasn't large, just a quiet fire behind the house, warm blankets, shared bread and stories. We sang, we prayed. And then something happened I hadn't expected. Thomas stood and announced that the community elders had decided to create a keeper circle, a small council to protect the cultural center for future generations. 5 members would guide decisions, programs, and preservation efforts. Then he turned to me. "We would like you to be the first chair." I felt my breath catch. Not because I doubted my worth, but because it had never occurred to me that I could lead not by bloodline or force, but by trust. I accepted, not with pride, with reverence. Some nights, I still felt the echo of the girl I used to be, the one who stayed quiet at family dinners, who swallowed words to keep peace, who believed that strength belonged to people louder than her. But that girl had changed. She wasn't gone. She had grown. Now, when I stood before others, I spoke clearly, not to demand space, but to offer it. And when I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw absence. I saw a thread woven into something bigger than me. Just before the first heavy snowfall, I got a letter. Not typed, not legal. It was from Nathan. Short, handwritten. I saw the article in the state paper. About the center. About you. I didn't understand what you were trying to do before. Now I think, maybe I never really knew you. I won't bother you again. But I hope one day I can visit not as your brother, just as someone willing to learn. I folded the letter and placed it on the altar in the cellar, beside Lenora's shawl. Maybe he would visit, maybe not. But for the first time, I didn't need him to. Forgiveness didn't mean returning to what was. It meant releasing what no longer had to be carried. A week later, Maya, the little girl who once told me she was no longer afraid to say she was Shoshone, came up to me after class. She had a hand-carved necklace clutched in her fist. "I made this for you," she said shyly. It was strung with beads and feathers and a small polished stone in the center. "That's your name?" she added. "In Shoshone, Saina, the one who returns." I knelt to accept it, trying not to cry, not from sadness, from recognition, from being seen. On the last night of the year, I stood outside alone under a sky streaked with stars and the faint glow of the moon. Snow covered the ground. The air was sharp, quiet. I held the necklace Maya gave me in one hand, the ledger in the other, and I whispered, "Thank you, Lenora, for waiting, for believing someone would come." A breeze stirred the trees, and somewhere in that hush, I thought I heard her answer, not in words, but in warmth, in belonging, in breath. Because this story, our story, was no longer waiting. It was alive. It was home.